if you're anything like I was, you've got a pedal board full of mismatched patch cables that are a little spotty from gig to another. You're always hunting for one that's going bad. They don't fit. You can't squeeze enough pedals on your pedal board. That's how I was until I discovered Tour Gear Design's patch cables. They're the smallest patch cables in the game. They're rock solid, extremely dependable, and I love what they make. And now I've partnered with Tour Gear Designs to get you 10% off your order by using the affiliate code down below in the description box. You can get 10% off using code 40WATT, 40WATT, but this deal gets even better. For my Patreon supporters, you actually are eligible for 20% off. You have to register with the same email address you use on Patreon and message the company, say you're one of my Patreon supporters, and you can get 20% off your order with Tour Gear Designs, the best patch cables in the game. This podcast is made possible in part through a partnership with TrueFire. TrueFire is the most comprehensive guitar learning experience on the internet, with over 51,000 guitar lessons from the best educators in the world. It makes TrueFire the #1 most trusted music education resource for guitar players. We as guitar players sometimes get fixated on the gear that we play, and we neglect the skill level that we play. And many of us have a hard time finding instructors locally. TrueFire bridges that gap. You can find my affiliate link below to get 40% off with my code 40WATT of your first purchase through TrueFire. Learn, practice, play, TrueFire. This podcast is made possible by the support of many wonderful people over on Patreon. If you would like to support this show and help make sure it keeps going, you can go over to patreon.com/40WattPodcast, where for as little as $3 a month, you can help make sure this show keeps happening. Thank you for all of your support. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of 40 Watt Podcast. My name is Philip. I'm your host. I'm super excited to be with you this week, bringing another episode of guitar geekery. I can't say guitar nerdery because Joe over at the Guitar Nerds will get on to me. We're going to bring some guitar geekery to the world this week. But first, I have some things I need to take care of. Just some odds and ends here and there. Look at the links down below in the description or in the episode notes. There's a bunch of stuff. There's some really rad folks who help support the show. Some affiliate links down there. Be sure to click those. Really appreciate those. If you also want to support the show, as you heard in the beginning, if you're not a Patreon supporter, because Patreon supporters don't have to listen to those ads at the beginning of the show. If you want to join and assist in making this show happen, you can join the Patreon, just like these wonderful people whose names I'm going to read now. Benjamin Rodway, Jamie Evans, Henry Klubakowski, Brian May, but not that Brian May, Heinrich Nordving of Nordving Custom Pedals, Tony DeGraw, Steve Rao of the 60 Cycle Hum podcast, Julie McFarling of Labland Photography, Abe Matthews, Jordan Galash, Duncan Watson, Andy Johns, David Evangelista of the Guitar Dads podcast, Blake Jefferson, Nick Call, Andrew Hensley, Alan Gresham, Dan Pilver of Lewitt Audio, Scott Hamilton of the Effects Loop podcast, Giacomo Ride, Andy Koning, Jim Burns, Tom Kelly, Heath Batt, Ben Fair, Rick Calhoun of Honey Picks, Jeffrey Walks, and Kyle Harris. Thank you all for your incredibly generous support in helping keep this show going. So, without further ado, I'm going to get right into this week's episode because I'm just going to tell you, guitarists and other instrumentalists, this week is really exciting, but it's also probably going to get down to a geeky level. I already know. But so I'm super excited about it. This week, I've got Hank Donovan from Rattlesnake Cable Company on the show. Hank, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm so glad you're on. We were just chatting a little bit before we got started, but I didn't want to accidentally delve into topics that we would talk about on the show because I've done that before. And wasted great content just chit-chatting before the episode starts. But so if folks aren't aware, Rattlesnake Cable, I think it's Rattlesnake Cable Company or...
That's correct. Yep.
Oh, awesome. So sometimes I get company names messed up in my head. So before we get too far down into, because I've got some questions. Cables are a thing. They're this mystical, they can be as mystical or as not to guitar players as you want them to possibly be. So before we go too far, how'd you get into music? How'd you get into guitar? And how'd you get into making cables? Like, give us the origin story.
Wow. So that's 3 big steps.
It is.
How did I get into music? I was a avid listener in junior high, but not a musician. I was way into metal. I was really getting into the dark stuff. We're talking the 80s, and
Sure.
Motley Crue, started getting into Metallica. Now I'm getting into sophomore, junior in high school, and then I start going into punk rock and right into just alternative music. So I was way into The Cure, the Smiths, but at the same time I was into DRI and the Misfits, and it was all over the place. And to me, that was the time where, as a listener of music, it went beyond just like, oh, that's got a sweet rhythm, it's got a good beat, it's like, that's a fun song, but actually getting into lyrics and the emotional state of what that music actually does for you. That was the first time where I wanted to go further into music. Immediately, I was like, okay, I want to get a guitar or bass or drum or something, join a band and start making art like this and expressing myself. So I was a senior in high school and I got my first guitar. I tried to get a guitar my freshman year. And I remember I called the music store because I wanted a Kramer because I was obsessed with Eddie Van Halen. And I was like, oh, I just want a Kramer and I want to paint it and do the whole thing. But, really at that point, I just wanted the guitar to look cool. But by the senior year, I wanted to have a guitar to actually create music. I still like Eddie Van Halen and all that stuff, but it was into that point, I was into, gothy, more sad stuff. And
Sure.
Luckily, I had a interesting friend group that were learning. One person learned bass, and I was playing guitar, and we'd play all of our favorite songs together and just start learning. That was a journey for, feels like, a million years until you get into bands and actually know how to play an instrument to some kind of level where, you can finish a song and not just, just crash and burn the whole time. So I've been in a bunch of bands throughout the 90s, the 2000s. I kind of took a break when I had some kids and then got back into it.
As you do.
As you do. And then in the middle of that 2000 era, 2006, 7, 8, I was dabbling with pedals a little bit. I got my first soldering iron, and it wasn't for pedals right away. It was for these little robot creatures called beam robots or junk bots. And it was,
I remember junk bots.
Yeah, it's the same concept where you just get a CD player, you break it all apart, grab the motor and hook a little capacitor to it, an LED, and maybe a little solar cell that you would get at Radio Shack, and they make these little insect things. I thought it was really just super cool. But that's why I bought my first soldering iron. And then as soon as I started doing that and having a lot of fun, that's where it just led into like, wonder can I make a pedal? Can I work on a circuit? Can I I was starting to understand components. And then I went down this whole thing with Vero boards and etching PCBs. I was just like going way into it. Just super fun.
Way deep.
Yeah, it was just super fun because it was almost instant gratification when it works, right? So you'd make something and you plug your guitar and like, wow, I don't know if that's what it's supposed to sound, but it did something.
But it makes a sound.
Yeah, it's like things came out of my amp and I can turn it on and off. So that was super exciting. And during that phase, I was making all sorts of pedals for friends and musician people. And I was kind of thinking that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be one of the, million people making pedals. And
one of those lunatics, as I call them.
Yeah. And it was fun. I enjoyed it, but there was also, I just felt there was so much for me to learn still. I got to a certain level. Imposter syndrome is really heavy at this moment. It's like, am I good enough to sell something? Is it worth spending the time to do it? And right at that same moment, I was just saying I wanted to make a couple of cables for myself. And that's where I was excited about making a couple of cables. And I took it to a band practice, and immediately one person says, "Hey, what's that?" I was like, "Oh, it's the cable I made." I wasn't even thinking it was a big deal. He's like, "Oh, that's really cool. Can you make me one?" I was like, "Yeah, okay." And then the other, "Hey, can you make me one too?" I'm like, "Sure." So I started making a cable here and there. And then the weirdest thing happened. I started getting phone calls. "Hey, I saw you made a cable for so-and-so. Can you make me one?" I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And then where I knew I was onto something is when I got a phone call from a person I didn't know. It was a friend of a friend of a friend that called me and said, "Oh, I heard blah, 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 blah." Right. And I'm not even trying to sell them. And that's where it kind of clicks. And I talked to my wife, who's like major component of this business right now. And she was working on the computer, and I was just sitting there, and I said, I think it'd be cool to make cables and make a business selling cables. And she just looks at me and says, "Yeah, that sounds cool. Let's do it." And, it's a hobby. It's a hobby business.
Right.
Right. And that was the first.
That's how it starts.
That was the first little pebble that got rolling down the hill. And here we are 11 years later where we're at now. So I think I hit all three of those.
Yeah, I think
those
you
events.
did. That's really wild. So it's really interesting that like you started out, building circuits and building pedals, etching your own PCBs, and then you, in my head, backtracked to making cables. Like, because I refuse to be dismissive and call it simple, but comparatively to etching your own PCBs and doing that kind of stuff, it's almost like I learned how to build rockets, and then I decided I wanted to make a go-kart.
Yeah.
I mean,
I could understand that point of view, but I remember making my first cable, and I remember plugging in, it didn't work. And I was like, it's 4 solder connections. The pedal I just made had like 140 solder points on it. And I could not figure. So the solder joints just broke. They cold soldered, cold jointed them. Hit them again, then still doesn't work. One side is still good. The other side broke again by the time I got to the amp. And I was like, okay, so, it's like a different heat, different time on the plug. And the difference between a pedal, a pedal is usually in a bomb-proof enclosure. Cable is, you're just whipping around, dropping plugs on the concrete, smashing the jack into the jack of the guitar. So a lot of ways they take a ton of abuse. So you have to really know how to like make them not break. And that's the tough part. So it was really humbling actually when I made my first cable. I was like, oh, this will be 5 minutes. I'll be done. And I was, an hour later, I'm still like, why can I not get this thing going? And I learned a lot in that first hour.
Yeah. Well, as someone who has repaired his own cables for a long time, and did so for the majority of that time within a very inferior soldering iron, I can tell you it's a frustrating experience, especially when you have that conversation like it's 4 soldered points. Yeah. This is it. But I have had cables where I just finally just in rage tied them in a knot and threw them in the garbage can. Like, I'm not going to bother fixing you anymore. It's cheaper on my mental health for me to just go buy a new one than to deal with you anymore. And usually that was, and this is where we'll talk a little bit about the importance of cables, because I do think they're super important. I'm a proponent of using the best cables you can possibly afford. Please don't go into debt for guitar cables, but Guitar Center or whatever music stores always got like the $5 bin or the $10 bin of cables. And I have friends who will just buy those over and over and over again. And they'll go through, 5, 6, 7, 8 more a year. And it's like, well, you could have just bought a really good cable in the beginning and saved yourself a lot of hassle, a lot of failures at gigs or at rehearsals, or, the quality of cables matters a ton. So when you start looking into cables, and I listened to your episode over on the Guitar Dads podcast, so nice. I'm not going to convince you to wax poetic about the importance of gold connections.
Oh, hey,
as you
easy.
Talked about. Easy. Yeah, I know. It's listener, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. It's pretty, but not necessary. That's it. So what goes into your cables? Sell me on your cables. I'm going to give you this opportunity, because while we love to talk gear, I love to hear people tell me what sets you apart. What's making yours different?
Well, I always like to start. Well, we'll just take the cheap cable, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so instead of like just going to what our cables are, I just kind of want to, because a lot of people think they're the same. It's like the same ingredients. It's the same thing. So maybe I make ours better than theirs. But when you talk about cheap cables, it always comes down to material. What makes it cheap or what makes it expensive? Copper. So the more copper the cable has, the more expensive it's going to be, because copper is expensive, especially nowadays. So when you have a cheap cable, it tends to have a very thin conductor in the middle. It tends to have very thin shielding for RF on the outside to save on that copper cost. And then it could still be the same thickness. They could pad it with insulator and PVC to make it the same thickness as a average cable, but inside of there could be just a nano hair for a signal, right? So that's the first understanding, where people you can't just go apples to apples on this cable costs this much and this one is this cheap. What's the difference, right? So that's your first thing. So on ours, we always make sure that our conductor is a 20 gauge conductor, so it's a thick conductor in the middle. Yeah, braided.
On that, before you get too far down that, because I know that in repairing my own cables and putting ends on my own cables, or heaven forbid we go back to the 2000s when I was lugging around PAs with PVCS 800 power amps, and they had the banana plug adapters that you've got to wire in all the time. Listeners, if you don't know what a banana plug adapter is or what a CS800 is, you're so lucky. I'm so jealous right now. Google those, you'll understand. Had a rack of CS800s that we would pick up and put in my pickup truck. That's dumb. My back is paying for it today. But, I'd have these cheaper cables where I would use my what's the term? Not wire cutters, but the strippers. Thank you. The wire strippers. I couldn't even strip the inside cable without ripping over half of the copper out of it. Mm-hmm. You sort of expect to sometimes lose a strand or two, but I would lose half of them stripping at the proper size, because it was just, they barely had any copper in the middle at all.
Yeah. Yep. So that's one factor where I feel like our cables have that value compared to a very cheap cable, just in the copper itself. And most importantly, our cable is actually milled in the United States. That's a huge one. So we actually spend a ton of money to work with wire mills in the US to actually mill our cable to spec and have it shipped up here to Montana. So that's a thing too, where, if you go overseas, the rules are all different for that. So that could lower the cost considerably. I like the fact that, we're going to be providing a job where they're milling it. We're providing jobs here in Montana for people to assemble it. And then when they come up here, they are all hand assembled, best components, Neutrik plugs, built with love. Because when I say built with love, I'm saying everyone here works or is a musician of some sort. And I always have this preface where I always bring up, do you remember the time ever in your life where gear has failed on stage and your band's looking at you, the crowd's looking at you, you're freaking out. You're checking your volume 5 times. You're checking to see if your amp's on for some reason. It's on, and you're just panicking. And I'm like, remember that feeling. And anytime you feel like cutting corners or you're feeling tired, just remember, we want to try to avoid this as much as possible. We're not guaranteed. Everything's got a shelf life. Anything could happen at any moment. But I want you to really appreciate that feeling. And luckily, everyone here knows what that feeling is. It's really hard to articulate that feeling to someone who's never been a musician on stage with something breaking. They don't know what that feels like. They go, oh, that must really suck. You have no idea how bad that sucks. So,
especially if you're already a nervous person and you have any issues with stage fright or anything like that, it's massive. It can ruin your appetite for performing live.
Yeah. And that's part of the hard knocks. You're going to have to go through it no matter what. If our cable didn't fail, someone's amp broke or someone's pedal broke or guitar's not working today. But we want to just try to make sure that we all have a conscious feeling of, we don't want that to happen. So that's kind of the mental effort juju that we're putting in the cables while we're making them, right? So besides the raw ingredients, where they're made and how they're made, that's all I got to tell you, to sell you on the cables.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you mentioned that whole failure on stage, and I tell people all the time, people message me and ask me, hey, my rig is doing this. And I'm like, I have a podcast that does not make me an expert at doing this, but let me see if I can help you. That's where I'm a librarian in my day job. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try to help you. I'm going to find you the answer. But the first thing I tell them is I need you to isolate and check every single one of your cables, because made up statistic time, 90% of the time it's a bad cable somewhere. And that's where your problem is. And I bought a cable tester years ago, and I used to use solderless kit cables, and I finally stopped. I've given up on it. I tried to even defend them for years, and I had to stop. I couldn't deal with it anymore. That's not to say there aren't great ones out there, listeners. I've not tried like the SIS, the solid core locking ones. I hear great things about them from the folks over at that pedal show, but the ones I've had have not been great. They do not last. And I've had them test perfectly, and then something not work in my rig, only to come and find out, yeah, it tested right. That cable still didn't work.
Yeah.
And I still don't know how that worked.
Well,
I've
just
never
moved it like this much, and then it, you know what I mean? It's like,
yeah, exactly.
You test it, works, you plug it in, it just moved, and now it's dead again. Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't have the patience to solder all my own cables. I'm going to be the first to tell you that. I envy those that have that time and that patience to do that, but I feel like I would need like a whole setup and need to do it all the time to feel like I was, first of all, good at it. Two, that it was worth my time to do.
Yeah.
So I totally get the wanting something that's gonna last, that's not gonna fail on you. I went to see I'm trying to think at which performance I've seen Jason Isbell a bunch of times at this point. I'm trying to remember where. I think it was at the Ryman, and they came out to do an encore, and his cable failed on him. And like, you're at the Ryman, you're Jason Isbell, and you're getting ready to play, and there's just no cable. Like, it just did not work. And so they swap. He's checking everything before he realizes it's the cable. So he's checking everything. Why isn't everything working? Tech comes out, they're checking everything, then just swaps cable out, ready to go. That was it. You know, cables are going to fail. I'm sure Jason is using great cables. I don't know whose he's using. I'm sure they're great, but even great cables will have an issue. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I feel like really sets your cables apart, and you're not the only ones doing this, but there's not that many, is the flair added to your cables. You can buy, I was on your website before we started recording and looking at cables, and you can buy just a, you know, plain old black weave cable if you want to, if that's your vibe. But y'all offer an awful lot of more options. When did that start that you decided you really wanted to make them stand out visually?
There was a friend of mine that owned a coffee shop and a bakery. And he had these cups that had the stamp of the bakery on it. But it was something at the time, you just saw people walking around with cups for coffee, and you just looked like a cup of coffee. But he really wanted to make it so he could see from across the bridge that was his business cup. And I thought that was just a really interesting point of view. I was like, So when we came up with our shrink tube, I was like, oh, I'll make Rattlesnake really big. I want to be able to, because now we do rattlesnake sightings, see them all the time.
Oh yeah.
And it's like, I don't have to pull out the magnifying glass and zoom. I'm like, I can just tell that's a rattlesnake over there. So that's part of it. And then when we started creating the logo and the name and just our whole vibe, I had very specific colors that I kind of wanted to go with. And those are their main, it was a dirty tweed, black, copper, red, and mean green, I do believe, was what we started with as just kind of a color palette. And then slowly we started adding other colors. And we always bring in limited colors just for fun. So, you know, we have purple going on that ends tonight. So that's not a regular color, and it won't be there on the website tomorrow. But, you know, next month it might pop
Which
in.
is when this episode goes live. So sorry, y'all. You're not going to get purple.
Yeah. Well, so that's part of the thing where we try to make cables fun. I felt like it was, I personally felt that part of the industry was not that fun. I had a lot of friends that are in the pedal industry, and I have a lot of friends in the guitar building and amp building. And I was like, man, you guys are doing all sorts of cool things. And I remember Spaceman effects. Do you know Spaceman? Yeah. So, I mean,
I haven't met the folks behind it, but I've had a couple of them, and they're great.
Yeah. I remember buying the Gemini fuzz a long time ago, and it was all silver. And then I'm like, man, that's so cool. And then they came out with the red one, limited 300 red. And I was like, I want the red for some weird reason. And I couldn't figure, and I'm like, this is genius. He just like makes a new pedal enclosure color. says it's a limited run of 300 and they sell out instantly. That's where it started thinking like, we can have fun with that with cables. I'm not going to do limited 200 cables, but I love the idea of, oh, we got purple running for 3 days. And, someone's been itching for purple and they saw it and they're going to buy it. So those were things I kind of wanted
Pete Honore,
yeah,
absolutely got to have that purple cable.
Yeah.
Well, we know this works. And I think, you get in marketing at any point. I used to work in bar and restaurant management. You get into marketing, limited is a word that people love. But then I realized just how powerful it could be when a few years ago during the pandemic, when I'm going to bring up Taylor Swift. Listeners hate when I bring up Taylor Swift. I love Taylor Swift. It's fine. But when she released Folklore, I think it was Folklore. I don't think it was the album before that, but which album is irrelevant. She released it, but then she released 12 different album covers to go with it. And each one sort of represented a different scene from the album, and did a limited release of LPs in each of the 12. Well, guess what? Like, the most hardcore fans are going to buy that album 12 times.
Yeah.
Because they have to have them all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's brilliant. There's a reason she's still selling physical media when nobody else seems to be able to do it.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's fun too, right?
Yeah.
It goes back to like collecting baseball cards or something. It's, it's like, wow, I want to get the whole set. There's a thing there.
I'm really guilty of finding, especially pedals, a pedal company that I love and just wanting to collect everything they've made.
Oh, yeah.
And I have a couple of companies that I won't mention. I do have a couple that I'm sort of actively have reverb searches set up for something going super low. That's like, okay, I can snag that now because I don't want to spend like full retail price when I'm just buying it to collect a set, It's such a bad idea.
Wow. Okay.
No, it's super expensive. It's super dumb. I don't recommend it for anyone. This is my hoarding. Yeah, I understand this.
Don't do it, people.
Yeah, don't do it. So you do these special runs. Again, Purple's ending tonight. I don't know if y'all are. I'm assuming that's maybe a Halloween or October run. Everybody seems to be doing a Halloween.
Well, tomorrow we will start a Halloween sale, so that'll work out. For this drop.
So listeners, as this episode is going live, it's going live a day later than usual because things happen. So you can go over to. Well, actually, you can click the links down below in the description to go find Rattlesnake Cables online and find whatever the new design is. So what is the new design? What you got, Hank?
Oh man, alls I know, we have 4 limited weaves coming. You caught me off guard because I don't remember what they are. I'm pretty sure it's Black Cherry, Ultraviolet, and there's 2 more. Oh, Tangerine is one, and I'm not sure what the other one is. Oxblood, I think. I can't remember. But yeah, we have 4 limited ones coming out tomorrow.
Oh, that's rad. So those are all available as of this episode. So as you're listening, go check it out.
Yep.
So you're doing regular cables. Obviously, this is going to you eventually expand it into you do patch cables, utility cables. That at least that's what you call them. Utility listeners are things like splitter boxes, and you do ABY boxes and stuff like that. When did you decide to get into that? And of course, now that I know you had a pedal building background, this makes total sense that you eventually get into this.
Yeah, the buffer was the first thing that we did, and I was literally just trying to scratch that itch. I wanted to be able to. There was a man, Sean, who worked or owned Loud Button. I don't know if you ever knew Loud Button.
I don't think I did.
They had the WTF. They were talking probably 2010, but he helped design the buffer circuit so it's on a PCB, so they're all through hole, and we had to assemble them all here. And that was my way of like, okay, it kind of feels like building a pedal, no foot switch in there, but it was something to get into. And the ABY was where finally landed. And we only do very short runs of those. We do 10 or 20 at a time, and they just sell out instantly. But we're not really tooled up for that, so
right.
It's kind of a pain when we switch to that kind of production. So that's why we only do just a small amount, because we're usually pretty busy, but they're fun to do. And I just love working on just little things like that. I mean, when we started, the business only had instrument cable. We only offered straight to straight plugs. nickel.
Oh, wow.
That's all I had. That's how it started from when we had the website. Rattlesnake was already, and then I remember we got straight to right angle. And everyone's yelling at me, we need golds. So we get golds in there. And then it starts, when are you getting speaker cables? When are patch cables coming in? Each one of those was a tooling up, a milling of that cable. So that patch cable is a different cable than our instrument cable, and the speaker cable is obviously different than. So that takes money and resources to get to the point where we can actually get a run a speaker cable and then maintain that speaker cable.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just chipping away.
So I'm curious for listeners that don't know, because this is something that it took me well into. I'd been doing audio engineer work before I finally learned this. And so for listeners, I'm gonna let Hank teach you this difference, because this is important. What's the difference in an audio cable and a speaker cable?
Okay.
'Cause this is a big deal, because listeners, I'm sure you know, not necessarily what the difference is, but you know that if you try to use a speaker cable as an audio cable, it's going to sound like shit. It's going to be bad.
Well, there's a couple of bad things with that. So your speaker cable is two conductors, two thick conductors. Ours are as a pair of 12 gauge conductors. So there's positive and negative going down those lines. Now, an instrument cable has a center conductor that sends signal, and then it has an outer shield. So if you plug that into an amp, it technically has two conductors. You can send positive down the tip and negative down the shield, but you don't want to do that. It'll work, but what happens is if you use a speaker cable or instrument cable, you're not getting the shielding. So you're going to get an insane amount of noise if you flip it the other way. But if you go with the instrument cable as a speaker cable, it'll technically work for a short amount of time or a long time. We don't know. Because that 12 or a 20 gauge conductor, which is smaller, could actually overheat. Depends on how hot you're pushing your amp. There was someone who still couldn't understand because they thought it worked. Therefore, he debunked that you can use them together. And I said it like this. I go, do you drive a car? Have you ever driven a stick shift ever? And they're like, yeah. I go, if I drove a car from point A to point B and then used all my gears, I'd get there. Right? That's using a speaker cable. Now, let's say I drive a car and put it in first gear from point A to point B, but never put it in second or third or fourth. Do you think eventually I'll burn up my engine or my transmission? It's the same kind of thing. You can get from point A to point B. You can get there, but you're going to blow up your engine. So even on our website, we have an articles knowledge base section where it has like speaker cable versus instrument cable. So don't take my word for it. I went and talked to Paul Rivera of Rivera Amps. I talked to Phil Jameson of Matchless Amps. I talked to Ben Verellen of Verellen Amps. And I asked them that question. And of course, they all said, you can't do that.
Right.
So, but I mean, I'm not an amp builder, so I wanted to get some opinions that mattered.
And that's the thing is, we know it doesn't work. And I wanted people to understand why, because I needed someone who knew. And obviously you've done the research. I can remember I'm a constant gear listing hawk. I'm constantly looking for things that I can try, or maybe, it's so cheap I can buy it, try it out for a little while, then turn around, sell it, and do that kind of thing. And I remember this guy on Facebook Marketplace had an amp for sale. It was I'm never going to remember this model number. It is one of the Ampegs that's around the same time as the V4 bass amp. So it's like the guitar version of the V4. And it had been a combo, and he had it converted to a head and cabinet. And he was talking about all this noise, and he's in the ad. He's like, it has some noise, probably needs new tubes or maybe filter caps or whatever. And he's got all these pictures. And I noticed in the picture, he was using an instrument cable for a speaker cable. And I messaged him. I was like, hey, dude, I'd love to get this amp for this price you're asking because you think it's broken. But have you tried using an actual speaker cable? And this is a musician. This is someone who has, not just someone who's listing it for a friend, doesn't know what he's looking at. And I'm like, you really should try a speaker cable before it. And it sat on Marketplace for like 10 months. And then I finally messaged him again. I said, I see you still have this. Have you tried the other cable so you can fix this listing? Because I think your amp's not broken. And then he finally did. And he said, holy crap, you were right. It was just, I was like, yeah, you think your amp's broken, but really you're just using it wrong.
Yeah. I mean, some
It's
speaker cables are so, again, the cheapness. You can get a speaker cable that looks thinner than an instrument cable, then it's truly a speaker cable. But it's just hard to if you're really not knowing what you're looking at, it's really easy to to confuse the two. They look, I mean, the same, the same plugs. It's a cable, looks like two monos. It should work, and it works
yeah.
when you plug it in, but it might not be great.
It reminds me of I always think about this every time I have to buy extension cords or anything like that. I once was running. I don't remember what I had plugged into it. It wasn't anything that had like a massive draw. I don't think. No, but every band has that like milk crate of extension cables or two or three, and had them run. And you do the thing where you coil up the excess so that it's like not taking up a ton of space and it's neat. And I think we may have actually been running an amp off of this, or maybe a couple of amps, but power just goes out. And it turns out, cheap extension cable, it had actually melted through the rubber outer casing and made contact with itself, and so it shorted itself out, and we lost. Luckily, amps were in surge protectors, and they did their job, and they worked. But it's one of those things you don't think about, and you just go with whatever works. And it's like all these guys I see out here and gals out here playing with these, them. They're the cables that have the yellow molded like shrink wrap around the ends, or sometimes it's red or orange. It's like, I don't know who's making these super, super cheap cables, but you find them in the back of every venue I've ever played, where bands have just tossed them aside at the end of the night because they stopped working entirely. So you're making these great cables. You've gone into full-time business making these cables, which that's got to be a nerve-wracking jump, because it's such a niche market in the music industry.
Mm-hmm.
So how have you seen, you started before a pandemic. So a lot of the guests I've had on the show have been, oh, well, during the pandemic, I needed something to do. And so I learned how to build pedals, or I learned how to do this. You've been doing it for a while, but it feels like I've only really heard your name in the last few years. So how's that growth for the company been?
It's been awesome. It's just one of those things that's just never good enough. As we go, I always think, oh, everyone probably at least heard of us, and then I keep running people, oh, it's the first time I ever heard of you guys, and I'm like, wow, I get a lot of work to do, but that's the fun part. I really enjoy marketing. I really enjoy trying to grow the business. It's been amazing. Pretty much from the day it started, it's just grown. It's never not grown. It's constantly, you look back last year and you're like, wow, we did so much better this year than last year. It's just, and then the future looks like impossible. You look at it and go, I don't know how we're going to make it. I don't know how we're going to beat last year. And somehow you look back at the end of the year like, wow, we smoked last year. It's crazy. And it's just it's a constant push on customer service and customer buying experience. That's pretty much where we hang our hat on this business. It's not about just making a cool thing and trying to, flip it out to the guitar generation out there. I really want to build a community of customers, one cable at a time. And I love the fact that when we do get customers every day, I get emails back talking about how much they love working with the company, or how much they like the product, how the whole system works for them. And I really enjoy it. It's about connection, and that's something I really strive to do. And from day one, and you talked about the service industry. That's where I come from. My wife comes from, also is working in a restaurant. So we have that same concept, because the restaurant is exactly the same. You have to have the FOMO with the crowd outside. It's got to smell good. You have to have good customer service. The food's got to be good. It's got to be repeatable. You can't have a good experience one day and then come by and get another cable and the experience is completely different. So we always try to maintain consistency from shipping to the quality of the product and how we're engaging our customers. So that's all part of I learned in a restaurant to make that successful.
See, I do training for librarians on customer service in public libraries, and the importance of it because of my bar and restaurant management background. And one of the things that I just just absolutely harp on is that when you're working with, and I call them customers, it drives people crazy. Librarians like, they prefer the term patron, and I totally get it. But I call them customers. I said, because they're not patrons yet. They're not a patron of your library yet. They're a customer. When they come to you for the first time to buy or to use your services or to do something, whatever it is, in any industry, that first time they're a customer. They're just they're paying for a service, but what you can do is, if you can build a connection with them and let them be connected to you in some way. Sometimes that's as simple as in the library, I tell people all the time, I said, we all have this patron who comes up and tells us obvious things. Like, hey, did you know your bathroom's out of order? Well, yeah, John, that's why there's a sign on the door. But don't be snarky. Please don't be snarky to people. But I tell my staff, and I tell other people, yes, they're telling you something that's obvious to you. They're trying to help. That's them trying to connect to you and build place and build community with you and that thing you're offering, whether that be a business or a library. People want to be connected to the things they accept into their circle of their life and be a community around those things. And that's what I love. And that was something I actually got from listening to your episode with the Guitar Dads, Matt and Dave, who are patrons of this show, that you really cared about that. And so that really matters to me. And hearing you talk, and now hearing you talk again about the importance of customer service and having that great experience and wanting to build community. That's what I have around this podcast. I don't do this podcast because it makes me money, because Lord knows it doesn't. I lose money on this podcast because it makes me buy things from the people I have on the show. It's a horrible, vicious cycle. But I do this podcast because I love having the community that's built up around the Instagram account or the Discord, or the community I've built of the builders and musicians that I know. And so that's so super important to me. But it's got to be especially tough with a cable company, because you build a product, you build a quality product. The problem is now they've got the product. Hopefully it's not going to break. And so you got to find a way to get them to come back.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. Do you have one cable?
Oh, hell no. Of course I don't.
So that's the thing. But our customer life cycle, which I hate saying that, I have a friend who owns an ice cream store, and he was talking about his customer lifestyles, or customer lifetime cycle, where he says, oh, I remember when a guy came and got a ice cream cone, and then 10 years later, he comes in there with his kid, has the ice cream cone. And then it's like another 10, 15 years later. Now his kid's got a kid. Now he's a grandfather, and he's still coming into the same place. I'm like, man, you can just go forever until literally the customer dies. That is your customer lifetime cycles. Literally, if they don't move, they die. You have them throughout that whole thing with ice cream cone. So in our world, it's an interesting cycle. Usually someone just discovers us, but they don't know anything about us really. They don't know how that customer service is going to be like. They don't know what the buying experience, they don't know how the interaction or the quality of the product, they don't know anything. So they're taking a gamble. They read the reviews. They might have heard something from something, watch this podcast. And then they'll buy just buy one cable and try it out. And then there's a whole sequence of things, they'll like, wow, it got built quickly. Thank you note was written in there. It looked really good when it came in. It plays. It sounds amazing. Okay, I'm gonna buy another one to replace my other, because I need two one from the pedal board to the amp, one from the guitar. Yep. And then like, oh, that experience should have been exactly the same. And they're super stoked. Now they go to the mode like, I'm gonna replace all my cables, the patch cables, speaker cables, XLRs. Then it goes to, oh, I got to convince my bass player to go to Rattlesnake. That person needs convincing. It might not be enough that he'll actually buy a cable for the bass player. Say, you're not going to buy it. I get it. But here, I'm just going to give you one. And then they get hooked. Then the super customer will literally just wait for that exclusive limited color. And then for whatever reason, they want that red one, just like I wanted that Spaceman, right? Yeah. So they'll buy that. And then, eventually it's like merch. They see you got the Fender shirt and all that. So it's like, it's the same thing. They'll just try to, because they want to keep having that experience because it's fun. I think, we all have that. And just like you collecting pedals of a certain brand, there's a thing there that's like, it's fun. And then usually it stops, at that point, it's like, okay, they're cabled up. I'm just hoping that they get a new, guitar rig and they want to have separate cables for that. And then they'll go down that road. But yeah, that is a challenge. It's not disposable. It's not
Right.
a consumable.
It's not throwaway.
Yeah.
It's so that's got to make it hard. So what does it look like? Because I'm always curious about this side of the equation, and it's got to be tougher. And you sort of referenced it on some other interviews and chats. Because it's great. You want to get the everyday players because that's the biggest market share. The bedroom players, which I don't mean that term derogatorily, listeners. Bedroom players, it's totally respectable. Some people just want to sit around and play in their bedroom. There's some great bedroom players, but that's the largest demographic: the weekend warriors and the bedroom players. But sometimes you got to get out and get other artists to use your cables, and I can see where having like this very identifiable aesthetic in your cables makes that even easier if you got artists using them. How is it starting to work with artists and trying to get them to use your cables? Do you find people hesitant to swap cables or to give them a try, or do you have any issues with that?
I mean, I always look at artists as, I think, I like, think of like the super rock star. They don't even care about what cable they're using. And they might even have just disposable cables. They don't even care. They don't even know because they got the text taken care of it. They just playing, right? They're getting free stuff all day long. So that tier, unless you're like paying for a gigantic sponsorship from some mega artist, we'll never get to that level. I'm not going to pay someone, $1 million to, to use Rattlesnake, and then Slash is rocking at Guns N' Roses with the Rattlesnake. I don't know.
Right.
I'm just that's not reality to me. So I'm always focused on what I would call the semi-pro musician. I think those are the ones I love the best for representing. And those are what are like just road dogs. Those are the ones that are touring 300 days a year. They may still be in a van. They might be fortunate to be on a headlining tour as a support act, but their connections are great. And they're probably guitar techs when they're not touring, or some kind of roadie situation. So they're connected to other techs. And when they get discounted gear or free gear, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for them. Right. And I love supporting those kind of bands because they actually try to rep the gear. They actually are like, feel like fortunate that, oh, I can't believe you're, hooking us up with this stuff. And they're super excited. And for those big acts, really, I always communicate with guitar techs. That's kind of like a weird circle that somehow, I don't know how I became connected with quite a few of them. And those are really interesting.
I've discovered from a buddy of mine who was in my first season of this show. I need to get him back on. My buddy Desmond, who is a guitar tech. It's what he works. It's a small crew of guys and gals who do that, and they rotate tours to tours. Like, you hear, it's only the biggest listeners. It's a big deal. Only like the biggest guitar players, the biggest bands have someone who is only their guitar tech. The others all share somebody on the road, and they call another band they know, or maybe their tech's like, hey, I can't make this tour because I'm doing this tour. Let me call my buddy. He's great tech. She's a great tech. They can do this tour with you, and you'll be super happy with them. And so getting in with the techs is a great way to start getting folks to try your stuff.
So that's where we seem to get that. So like I said, the artist might not even know. It's the tech set up the back line with all Rattlesnake, and and sometimes there's artists that, we're really excited about and are really, excited that they're using our cables and they clearly know about it. But the techs, I always think those guys are just the coolest because it's like being in the band, because when it's a tight circle, because it's like, you have to be a good hang and you have to be trustworthy. And you just don't put a help wanted sign for that. So when a tech can't do this tour, that tech knows, I trust these two people because they could hang with the band. They're cool, and they're going to make sure you're taken care of. That's why it's such a tight circle. And it's just always amazing. We're in Missoula, and I'll get phone calls, and I'm like, hey, I'm in town, I'm doing some show, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, wow, it's so random. Weren't you just on this tour, whatever, last year? And now, it's crazy life. But
It's not for me,
No,
but it's
hard.
it's those up and coming bands. Actually, it's how I heard about your cables for the first time. My buddy Jacob Arnold, and the Bird Dogs, Mississippi country band. He writes
Nice.
really really great music. I think listeners, I've never mentioned him on the podcast. I should probably get him on the podcast at this point. But he's also super nerdy about gear like I am. He and I share a lot of taste. But he started working with y'all last year
Oh,
and
cool.
posted about y'all's cables and working with y'all and how great it was. And since then, it's been one of those things that's just been on I back of my mind. It's like I need to check this out. So it's obviously working. Those smaller bands, they're out there repping the stuff, and people are going to hear about it. And I love that you and what you said here is a little bit what I heard on the Guitar Dads podcast when you talked about it. I love that there are brands out there who are looking at that. And your artist spotlight statement on your website says, do you have to be famous? No. Do you have to be professional? No. Do you have to be passionate about what you're doing and use our cables? Yes. Yes, you do. That's it. That's all you're looking for.
Yeah.
I think that builds great connections
Oh, yeah.
because eventually one of those bands is going to be a band that breaks it big, or brings more people to what you're doing and being excited about it. And you want them to say good things about you. It's going to come back to that customer service aspect.
Yep.
Awesome. So what I'm not gonna go down your entire product listing. Listeners, y'all can go over to the website and check that out. I did have a question, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's curious about this, and I tried to find a picture to tell me or not. I have a peeve about right angle cables, and I need to ask you if you're using the ones I prefer. I like Telecasters, and Telecasters are notoriously torture for right angle plugs.
Yeah.
Some are using the extended plug now. That are do you have the extended right angle plugs?
Yeah. So it all depends on what kind of tele you have and how that electro socket's set up. So it seems like older, more vintage ones are deeper, and that's where you have more of the problem. And more of the modern ones seem like, even Neutrik right angles generally, I'll say that with quotes, generally will work. Just because it could be dependent on how they set up that jack. If it's way down in there, it still might not reach. Yeah. But we do offer the G&H tele plug right angle.
Okay.
It's not on the website. It's a custom. So I do have people, usually when it's a tele person that is traditionally knows that they have problems with the right angle, they will always send me a message and they'll say, do you have something that'll address this or not? And those tele plugs seem to be great. I think they're awesome. I also like to use those with a mid-sized barrel for speaker plugs also, because they're great for right angle in recessed ports. Like the old Marshall cabs, and they have that recess. You can't put a right angle in it. Well, guess what? With those, they'll reach.
So that's a great point. I haven't had a Marshall or a 412 or any recessed cabinet plug in a long time. I'd kind of forgotten that was a thing. But now that you mention it, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Yeah.
And so I like the idea. I like the idea of a right angle on a speaker cabinet in general, especially I've been on stages where, techs have to be able to walk behind the amps, and there's nothing scarier. And I know one of listeners of this podcast can know this. There's nothing scarier than having an amp go quiet all of a sudden and then realize it's been running without a speaker plugged in because someone tripped over or banged into the plug, maybe broke the plug off. It's right angles. Get right angles. I need to do that, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah. None of mine have right angles, so maybe I have to order some. Get some speaker cables with right angle plugs.
Nice.
Yeah. So as we're getting on close to the end of the regular episode, I want to give you a chance to tell everybody where we can find you, where you are, all the different things. Are your Instagram, Facebook? Who knows what everybody's doing? Threads, X. I don't know. I can't keep up with all the social media. TikTok. So Hank, where can they find you online?
Well, you pretty much named them all. We're everywhere. Okay. So we're in Snapchat, TikTok, all that. But really, I just focus on
Snapchat. That's one I haven't heard in a while.
I know. I only do reels, and I push them over to Snap Stories or whatever. But yeah. Anyway, I just do it because it's easy enough to do it. But Rattlesnake, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook /Rattlesnake Cables. And we also have a thing for you too, for the listeners. If you go to rattlesnakecables.com/40watt, there's a 20% coupon for you too. But if this drops tomorrow, we got a Halloween sale, but this is for people that might listen to this 3 weeks from now or whatever.
Oh, that's awesome.
All you have to do is go to that, rattlesnakecables.com/40watt.
Well, thank you. Well, listeners, that link will be down below as well. I'll make sure that it's in there when I get done editing this. And go check out Rattlesnake. Go follow him on Instagram, on Facebook, Snapchat, if you still do it. I deleted mine literally a few weeks ago when I realized I had one person still in my life who Snapchatted me. And I was like, I need you to take this to Facebook Messenger because I want to delete this app. So awesome. Well, Hank, thank you so much for coming on the episode. We're going to go over to Patreon. We're going to keep talking a little bit.
Sweet.
I won't make you retell the story of the origin of Rattlesnake. Y'all, he lives in an area around Rattlesnake River or Rattlesnake.
Yeah, there's a Rattlesnake Valley in the creek there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a region. It's a regional thing. Although I'm from Mississippi, so rattlesnakes, I know all about rattlesnakes. We have 3 different species down here.
Oh wow.
Oh yeah. It's a thing. I've seen rattlesnakes big enough that I wasn't sure they weren't pythons of some kind. So that's real around here. In the meantime, listeners, we're going to go over to Patreon. If you are a Patreon supporter, I can't wait to have you over there hanging out with us. If you're not a Patreon supporter, remember you can be patreon.com/40watt podcast. Links down below. But until we talk again, until we hang out again, y'all remember to be good to yourselves, be kind to each other, and make some noise.